Hello, good morning and welcome. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for the opportunity to be with you here again, and I'm very grateful for all of the organization that has allowed me to be here in comfort. I want to talk about two issues that have captivated attention among scholars, policymakers, commentators, and the community at large. These issues have generated so much research, debate, and discussion, but with limited consensus or even clarity. My work over the last 2 decades has focused on them as two separate concepts. Now, I have concluded that they are highly integrated. I'm talking about Islamophobia and radicalization. In the popular imagination, one refers to the fear or dread of Islam, and the other to the apparent Islamization of Islam. However, my argument, in its simplest terms, is that Islamophobia is a function of racism, and racism causes radicalization. In this presentation, I will talk about how I've come to this conclusion based on my existing and ongoing research. I will also talk about how my aims and objectives tally with some of the ideas I have going forward. Much of what I talk about refers to Muslims in Britain, but I'm also broadening my ideas to a wider Western European framework. So, my argument is that there is a symbiotic relationship between Islamophobia and radicalization in relation to young Muslims in the West, which are referred to as Western Europe, North America, and Australia. And there are a number of ways that the interrelationship strengthens externally. Politically, as the shift to the right intensifies with local, national, and global impacts. Culturally, as botched multicultural policies replace indifference with difference. Economically, especially since the global downturn that began in 2008, and religiously, due to a focus on secular liberalism, which is exclusive rather than inclusive. And there are a number of ways in which the relationship strengthens internally. Politically, due to a lack of adequate representation and participation. Culturally, as groups are forced into retreat in the face of aggression and exclusion. Economically, as part of ongoing patterns of social immobility, and religiously where conservatism and traditionalism emerge in a vacuum. Now, while for some these internal issues are seen as the essential issues, I argue that they exist due to the external factors. It locks communities into a state of isolation and disenfranchisement. Meanwhile, dominant powers focus on the problematic others as the reasons for all the malaise. In general, my academic research has concentrated on 3 primary interrelated themes. First, I explore questions relating to ethnic relations, ethnic inequality, and identity politics. This looks at theories of race, racism, and racialism, with a particular emphasis on the British case. Second, I have a particular interest in the positions of Muslims in Western European societies in the post-war on terror period, especially in Britain. I analyze how structural and cultural factors shape identities, where racism and discrimination persists on the one hand, and on the other, where there are internal challenges of identity formation which exist within specific community formations. I examine how these interactions have evolved within a global hegemonic framework. It influences Muslim identity politics at the national level, creating acute challenges at the local level. And third, over the last decade or so, I have focused on the question of Islamophobia and radicalization. And while trying to understand these concepts as separate entities, I'm now saying that they are part of the same, two sides of the same coin. The forces that drive Islamophobia are similar in design and impact to those that give rise to radicalization. While Islamophobia is a hot topic, so is Islamism. And since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, scholars and commentators have used the concept of Islamic fundamentalism. The study of the politicization of Islam soon developed into political Islam, which became common academic parlance until the emergence of Islamism. It refers to those who want to introduce Islam within the political realm or to change it from the outside. Since 9/11, Islamism or Islamic radicalism remain in the spotlight. Events in London, Amsterdam, Boston, Paris, and recently Brussels have spawned further interest in it. All have stimulated a broad awareness on the topic. However, Islamism is a much maligned and misunderstood notion. Generally, the view is that Islamists are Muslims advocating a highly literalist interpretation of Islam. Rarely is it used objectively or even to reflect on Muslims' merely as political actors, including in the sense of potentially generating positive social outcomes. In the UK, the recent Prevent legislation has also added to these anxieties, including in the higher education sector in England and Wales. Policy converging on Islam, both at home and abroad, has the potential to isolate the very communities it hopes to influence. In addition, the securitization of multiculturalism has also grown out of counterterrorism policy across the US and in Western Europe. In an effort to reduce political violence, policymakers and community actors have all toyed with de-radicalization, re-radicalization, and even re-Islamization. However, they have limited bearing because, once again, the emphasis is on religion, not on the lived reality facing Muslim communities. Islamism is an opportunity for positive social outcome. However, elites in the policy world and in academia appropriate it for less constructive ends. On the question of British Muslim radicalization, I've identified 5 periods linked to various phases of post-war migration, settlement, and integration policy. Now, of course, there are those who argue that the causes of radicalization are structural and institutional. And there are those who believe that they are a function of cultural and religious matters, unhindered in various models of integration and multiculturalism. This has given view to the so-called Londonistan thesis. This populist view persists among the left who do not do God, and among those on the liberal right who view Muslim demands as a specific problem for diversity. So in these 5 phases of British Muslim radicalization, all are associated with the social, economic, and political contexts of the time. The first wave UK jihadis emerged during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The second wave emerged after the Bosnian crisis in the early 1990s. The third wave before and just after the war on terror. The fourth wave after the war in Iraq, and more recently, in the post-Arab Spring climate and the emergence of the Islamic State. The debate in relation to how we see minorities has also changed. Multiculturalism is now equated with securitization. Islamism is equated with terrorism. So, one foremost explanation for radicalization is alienation. Various forms of prejudice, discrimination, and racism give rise to processes of acute alienation among young Muslims, which creates the motivations for radicalization. This alienation encourages young Muslims, mostly men but not always, to seek alternative articulations as a reaction to individual, community, and group subjugation. This is then theologically abstracted, accelerated via various social and digital media. Now, much of this radicalization involves British South Asian groups, ordinarily from traditional Sunni backgrounds, such as the Deobandis or the Barelvis, both part of the Hanafi school. The fact that no Shia groups are implicated in acts of terrorism on European soil is a noteworthy observation and one demanding greater thought. When religion does matter, these South Asian Sunni Muslim groups are seeking an interpretation of Islam differing from that of their parents. There is an acute intergenerational disconnect. It stems from a need to express an identity that is of their own making, thus far denied to them by their communities and society at large. For most women, the need to express Islamic feminist principles such as social justice, gender equality, comes to the fore for those seemingly locked in. Like some young men, some young Muslim women are also drawn to theaters of war in places like Iraq and Syria, and arguably for the same reason, revenge, status, identity, or as a thrill, adrenaline junkies, if you like. And for men, recent research has also demonstrated that levels of testosterone and a desire to follow a single leader is a biological predisposition. This explains to some extent why young men the world over are drawn to various radical groups, including the far left, the far right, and religious extremist groups. And in the case of Muslim extremist groups, resistance to society stems from alienation and the perception that Islam is under attack. It is also the case that this idea of so-called decadence of Western secular liberal life and all its immoralities, including alcoholism, voyeurism, consumerism, and sexual liberation, are also a push factor. And we see this among so-called revert stroke converts too, and the fact that we have quite a few German-born women in ISIS is something that we need to think about in terms of the drivers, the mechanisms, and the reasons why they would take part in those activities. So a few defining features are necessary to consider in understanding the processes. So it's meaningful to note whom the Muslims in Europe are and their migration histories and how matters have evolved socially, politically, and economically. If we look at the main countries, the sending countries, France, Britain, Germany, they are host to post-war migrant groups who came to fill employment sectors that were least desired by the indigenous population after the post-war reconstruction process. And we're talking about second, third generation European-born young individuals who feel compelled to take part in these activities far away from their countries of birth. These are very strong parallels in all of these contexts, and there is a generalizable set of factors that we can determine as a way in which to explain this. There is a need to look at ongoing patterns of deindustrialization in urban areas and globalization, which is the converse side of it. The fact is that there is a certain element of neoliberalism that has created a vacuum in relation to young people who feel their futures have been compromised. And this also includes young people drawn to far-right groups. And we can see the emergence of, for example, Pegida in Germany as a function of a sense of insecurity about the future of their own lives in the context of migration at one level, but also in terms of the economic condition of Germany for some communities in some sectors. We also have to think about the role of the state here. Various policies of assimilation, integration, anti-racism, and multiculturalism have come and gone. But concerns over racism and ethnic inequalities persist. In fact, they are very much deeply entrenched in the way we can observe these patterns in the context of education, employment, representation, participation in politics, also in terms of media. Not just in terms of those few who get to be in front of the screen, but the people who are making decisions, editorial decisions behind the scenes, and have roles in producing programs, and so on. So policies have provided all the lip service and have moved with the time, but they haven't really affected the reality on the ground. We are still looking at highly observable, visible, urban ethnic communities that are detached from the rest of the workings of society. Communities which moved to certain parts, certain areas of towns and cities that were facing decline 30, 40, 50 years ago and have remained cut off from progress felt elsewhere in society. So they are very much the left behind. And I'm talking about Muslim minority communities, but also indigenous, once working class communities. And when we see these points of conflict in these urban areas, it's often the poorest white indigenous communities and the poorest ethnic minority communities who are conflicting the most for the least in society. This is what's important to think about as well. The debate, the discourse in terms of how we think about difference has also changed. In the 1940s and 50s, cabinet papers released talk about how ministers discussed a colored problem and how we would manage such a set of issues in the British context. From color to race, to ethnicity. Now we talk about religion. Religion is the marker of difference that separates us and them, you and me. Whereas before various recent events, religion was not seen as a function in ways in which demarcations such as this took place. Indeed, European Muslims were first invisible. They were part of the ethnic category, the migrant story, if you like. But from the 1980s and since, prevailing media and political discourses have altered dramatically. The Rushdie affair in 1989 shifted the terrain significantly. Muslims were no longer this invisible Asian category. They were this religious community wanting certain demands. They wanted to ban a book. They were asking for blasphemy laws. And not only that, they're intolerant and zealot and violent and aggressive, and they're our neighbors. So these are the kind of discussions that came about then. And more recently, the Danish cartoons, in our more recent memory, has illustrated the idea of the visibility of Muslims as such. First openly discussed in the mid-1990s, Islamophobia is clearly a variation of xenophobia and Orientalism, but it is a whole lot more than that. In class discussions I have with my students, in fact yesterday morning in my MA group, what is Islamophobia? Is it a function of the the group characteristics that we regard as somehow problematic, or are they preconceived fears that we carry that have been created by our socialization, by what we talk about across the dinner table, what we read in the newspapers, what our television newsreaders tell us? How are we, for example, afraid of spiders if we've never encountered a spider? How are we afraid of Muslims if we've never met a Muslim? We are so because we are made to feel so. Of course, there are criticisms of Islamophobia, and I am the first to raise the flag on that. But it is intellectually, conceptually powerful. The problem is that when we start to talk about Islamophobia, we focus on religion, and we take attention away from urban Muslim communities, where all the problems are as such. But there is an immense interest in these concepts of Islamophobia and radicalization. And as the cultural and hegemonic rhetoric concentrates on Islamophobia, the reality facing Muslim communities are often overlooked. Similarly, there is a dominant projection that radicalization emanates from limitations within Islam. Both approaches concentrate on grand narratives. In addition, there is insufficient consideration how both concepts are indeed interrelated and reinforce each other. So my work argues that there is a prevailing discourse that is an attempt to take away stress from patterns of urban racism and wider institutional discrimination. The dominant rhetoric disregards discrimination and disadvantage, who are then facing Muslims, who are then perpetually objectified and racialized. It sets in motion the ability of elite actors to reinforce cultural stereotypes and emphasize cultural relativism and cultural dissonance as the drivers of social problems. To redress the imbalance, Muslims actually need to take ownership of both concepts from below. But the dilemma is that governments react to events, ratcheting up existing counterterrorism, policing and surveillance legislation, and even anti-immigration policy, when arguably there is no evidence to determine it. And while there are much behind-the-scenes activities here, there are tremendous pressures to produce tangible deliverables among various institutions of the state, where there is further extensive politicization of radicalizations, fueling misunderstandings and giving license to gross generalizations. There are indeed some Muslims involved in acts of terrorism who were previously on the radar of intelligence and security services. The fact that they slipped through the net suggests ineffective existing policy, not the need to ratchet up existing legislation. And current attempts made by the UK government to enhance the legislation have led to accusations of pre-crime agenda. And vast generalizations about the apparent conveyor belt approach to this so-called paths to radicalization leads to further stigmatization of an already much beleaguered community. Foucault's theory of biopolitics explains how far-right groups mimic the biopolitical racism of the state. They subsequently reproduce the most intense characteristics of racism against Muslim minorities. But molded in the urban centers of Western Europe, both groups are entrenched in the economic and political transformations that connect center and periphery. It represents a microcosm of globalized conflicts. It leads to the reconfiguration of former working classes into various protest-resistant movements, ever centering on the so-called purity of racialized identities, where class identities have failed all groups. For disaffected Muslims, where the local and the global have proved futile, the search for the global enters the frame. There has also emerged not only an Islamophobia industry, but also a radicalization and de-radicalization industry. And here various people have come forward with initiatives supporting the government with references to the causes and solutions to Islamic political radicalism. All of this takes attention away from what's going on in real communities, in urban areas all over Western Europe. The five waves of radical Salafism that I talked about correlate with economic transformations beginning in the 1980s, leading to considerable restructuring of Western Europe. Since 9/11, the apparent risks associated with norms and values of a diverse ethnic and religious minority population have raised considerable attention. Elite media and political actors regard Western European Muslims at odds with the ethno-nationalist European ideals of citizenship and belonging. But Western European Muslims are in the uncomfortable position of having to defend group rights in the context of ongoing patterns of racism, discrimination, and disadvantage. Furthermore, they face the brunt of media and political discourses constantly perpetuating the view that Muslims are a threat, to both national identity and the security of the nation. This demonization of Islam and Muslims connects with foreign policy in relation to the Muslim world, which further exacerbates the conditions for radicalization and extremism. While states invariably enact measures to protect vulnerable groups, the solutions to both Islamophobia and radicalization are in the hands of Muslims to mobilize pro-integration and pro-interfaith civil society activism. So once again, I'd like to thank you for your time and the opportunity to talk to you about my ongoing research and interests. I look forward to your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for your time.